I just got a terribly tragic bit of news. That plane crash, Howard Hunt's wife was on it. And it's, his wife is dead? Yes, sir. She was killed in that.
December 8th, 1972. It's 1 in the afternoon in the nation's capital at Washington National Airport. United Airlines Flight 553 is a 737-200 preparing for its regularly scheduled flight from Washington, D.C. to Omaha, Nebraska. This flight has an intermediate stop at Midway Airport on Chicago's south side. On the flight today are 6 crew members, and preparing to board are 55 passengers, including 5 children and 2 infants. Departure time is scheduled for 1:50 Eastern Standard Time, with a time en route of 1 hour and 42 minutes to Chicago Midway Airport. Departure weather in Washington was reported to be 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with light winds out of the north-northeast at 8 knots, with mainly cloudy skies. We invite you to join us as we take a closer look at the crash of United Airlines Flight 553 and ask the question, crash or conspiracy?
In command of Flight 553 is Captain Wendell Lewis Whitehouse, age 44, employed by United Airlines on 30 January 1956. Captain Whitehouse has 18,000 total flight hours, 2,435 of which are in the 737-200. It's worth noting that Captain Whitehouse flew an unsatisfactory 737 proficiency check in April of 1970. He was rechecked in May of the same year and passed. First Officer Walter O. Coble, age 43, employed by United Airlines on October 4th, 1957. First Officer Coble has 10,638 hours total flight time, 1,676 hours on the 737. On June 19th of 1972, he also failed a Boeing 737 proficiency check and was rechecked 3 days later and passed. A third pilot was also in the cockpit. Second Officer Barry J. Elder, age 31, employed by United Airlines on May 8, 1967. Second Officer Elder has 2,683 total flight hours, 1,128 of them in the 737. It's worth noting that Second Officer Elder was a qualified Boeing 737-200 first officer as of September of 1970, but due to company personnel reductions, he reverted to second officer status on the aircraft. The cabin crew on board Flight 553 consisted of 3 flight attendants: Marguerite J. McClawson, D. Janine Griffith, Kathleen S. Durrett. Also on board Flight 553 are some notable passengers, the first being CBS News reporter Michelle Clark and U.S. House of Representatives member George W. Collins, as well as Dorothy Hunt, former CIA employee and wife of Watergate conspirator E. Howard Hunt. The accident aircraft, registered as November 9031 uniform, was manufactured on September of 1968. There were 7,247 total hours on the aircraft. Aircraft records showed all inspections and overhauls had been performed within prescribed time limits and maintained to FAA and company standards. The 737-200 was powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney JT8 engines. Flight 553 departed Washington, D.C. at 1:50 p.m. local time and proceeded towards Chicago at a cruising altitude of 28,000 feet. All was normal until about an hour and a half later, when a light illuminated to inform the pilots that the flight data recorder had failed. "Recorder go off?" Captain Whitehouse asked. "Yeah," said the second officer elder. "See what's going on with it, will ya?" Whitehouse ordered. By this point, Flight 553 was already on approach to Midway and had been cleared down to 4,000 feet. They were second in line behind a light twin-turboprop Aero Commander, which was much slower than the 737. In order to keep the two planes far enough apart, the controller asked 553 to slow to 180 knots. A little over a minute later, he asked them to slow again, this time to 160 knots. The pilots slowed down by extending flaps to increase drag and by reducing the engine power. Now the controller cleared Flight 553 to descend to 2,000 feet, and First Officer Coble replied, "Down to 2,000, 553, leaving 4. Except Captain Whitehouse hadn't actually begun the descent, because he and Second Officer Elder were still trying to troubleshoot the flight data recorder. "Christ, I can't even find the circuit breaker for this," Elder complained. After locating it, he added, "Don't know what to say. I get a reaction when I pull the AC." "No reaction when you pull the DC, though," said Coble. "Want me to call maintenance?" Elder asked. "Call it in," said Whitehouse. Having remained at 4,000 feet for 35 seconds after being cleared to descend, now he finally initiated the descent to 2,000 feet. However, Captain Whitehouse seemed to be unaware of the extra distance they had traveled during this time. The plane was nearing the outer marker, which signaled the beginning of the final approach phase, and the recommended altitude for crossing the outer marker was 1,500 feet. Captain Whitehouse had chosen a descent rate of 750 feet per minute, which would be insufficient to reach this altitude by the outer marker. During the descent, the crew extended the flaps to 30 degrees, resulting in an increased lift which momentarily caused the plane to level off. However, the engine power setting was too low to maintain airspeed in level flight with this configuration, causing the plane to slow from 150 knots to 130 knots before Whitehouse restarted the descent. Just before 2:26, Flight 553 passed over the outer marker at a height of 2,200 feet. This is 700 feet higher than the recommended altitude. Recognizing that they were too high, Captain Whitehouse configured the plane to achieve a descent rate of 1,550 feet per minute, more than the amount recommended for final approach. To accomplish this, he deployed the speed brakes, a set of spoilers which pop up from the wings to increase drag and reduce airspeed. Using the speed brakes while inside the outer marker is rather unusual, and the need to use them showed that the approach was not sufficiently stabilized. Indeed, altitude was not the only area in which the crew was mentally behind the aircraft. It is only now that Captain Whitehouse called for the final descent checklist, which was supposed to be completed before crossing the outer marker. As Whitehouse and Coble hurried to complete their final descent check, routine tasks like monitoring the airspeed fell by the wayside. The pilots rattled off one item after another from the checklist. Flight and nav, cross-checked. Landing gear, down, 3 green. Speed brake, armed, Coble replied, glancing briefly at the speed brake light. In reality, the speed brakes were fully engaged, not merely armed, but the speed brake armed light would remain illuminated in either of these positions. He apparently did not check the actual position of the lever. Just as they finished the final descent check, Captain Whitehouse caught sight of the ground through the clouds and realized that they were arriving at the minimum descent altitude of 1,000 feet, below which they could not descend without visual contact with the runway. Whitehouse abruptly leveled off at 1,000 feet, but in doing so, he forgot to retract the speed brakes. With the speed brakes still extended, while in level flight, the plane began to decelerate rapidly, and it was already traveling at less than 130 knots. Concurrent to these events, the controller was becoming increasingly worried about the separation between Flight 553 and the Aero Commander ahead of it. Concerned that the Aero Commander would not have enough time to clear the runway before the 737 landed behind it, he wanted to order the small plane to shift over from runway 31 left to the parallel runway 31 right. But it was too late for the small plane to change course. Instead, he called Flight 553 and said, "United 553, execute a missed approach, make left turn to a heading of 180 degrees and climb to 2000. It was this exact moment that several things happened at once on board Flight 553. Just as the controller began his transmission, Captain Whitehouse noticed their decaying airspeed and accelerated the engines from 59% to 75% power. At almost the exact same moment, just as the controller said the word execute, the airspeed dropped low enough to trigger the stick shaker, which physically shook the pilot's control columns to warn them of the impending stall. Whitehouse and Coble scrambled to respond to this sudden convergence of events. Whitehouse, unaware that he had left the speed brakes extended, apparently concluded the plane's configuration was inducing too much drag, so he retracted the flaps from 30 degrees to 15. This actually had the opposite of the intended effect, reducing the lift generated by the wings and making the situation worse. Coble responded to ATC, "Okay, left turn to 180, left turn, okay." "Want more flaps?" asked Second Officer Elder. "Flaps 15, someone said, followed a second later by, "I'm sorry." At this point, Captain Whitehouse realized his mistake, extended the flaps back to 40 degrees, and raised the landing gear. But neither the flaps, the raised landing gear, nor the extra engine power were sufficient enough to overcome the drag from the speed brakes, and Flight 553 stalled at a height just 400 feet above the ground. Massive vibrations rocked the plane as it pitched up steeply and began to fall from the sky. Passengers cried out in terror, and the pilots screamed in surprise as the plane plummeted tail first towards the densely packed houses below. At such a low altitude, there was no hope of recovery. Although Captain Whitehouse finally recognized the problem and retracted the speed brakes, it was already far too late. A split second later, Flight 553 clipped a tree and a garage before careening into a house on West 70th Place in Chicago's West Lawn neighborhood. The house exploded in a hail of flying bricks, and the left wing cleanly sliced half the roof off of another house. The plane then skidded across the street and slammed headlong into 3 more houses. These houses were reduced to rubble by the massive impact. The fuselage broke in two and the forward section all but disintegrated. At the same time, a wall split the cockpit down the middle, instantly killing the first officer. As soon as the plane came to a stop, a massive fireball erupted amid the tangled debris as spilled jet fuel ignited. Within seconds, towering flames were rising on both sides of the plane. And those who had survived the initial crash now faced the threat of burning alive. Firefighters and police arrived on the scene within minutes, only to find the plane already almost completely consumed by a raging inferno. Survivors who had staggered out into the street were loaded into ambulances and rushed to nearby hospitals. While firefighters eventually tackled the massive blaze, the fire was not extinguished until nearly 30 minutes after the crash, by which point rescuers held out little hope that anyone else would be found alive. But in fact, one person was still clinging to life among the mangled wreckage: flight attendant Marguerite McLaughlin, who had been seated just behind the cockpit during the crash. She was thrown partially out of the plane and into a pile of aircraft debris and rubble from a house. This shielded her from the flames. As firefighters combed through what remained of the cockpit, she later told news reporters she heard one of them say, "I don't think anyone is alive in this part of the plane." Desperate to get their attention, she began to yell and scream from under the debris, attracting the attention of the rescuers, who began a delicate operation to free her. Minutes later, she was free and rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She was the only survivor seated forward of the wings, and despite suffering extensive injuries to every part of her body, she eventually made a full recovery after spending 3.5 months in the hospital. Unfortunately, most of those on board Flight 553 weren't so lucky. 43 passengers and crew were dead, including all 3 pilots. While only 18 escaped with their lives, rescuers also discovered the bodies of 2 West Lawn residents who were killed when the plane impacted their house. The National Transportation Safety Board was quickly informed of the accident, and within hours a team of investigators arrived in Chicago from Washington, D.C. When they arrived at the site of the accident, they were surprised to find around 50 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation already on the site, interviewing survivors and listening to air traffic control tapes. The investigators thought this was unusual, but within 24 hours, the FBI closed its investigation into the accident and gave the NTSB full control of the crash site and all relevant materials. The NTSB was frustrated to find that a mechanical failure had rendered the flight data recorder inoperative just 14 minutes before the crash. But the cockpit voice recorder was working normally, and the tapes were successfully played back the following day. The recording revealed that Flight 553 had stalled at a low altitude, confirming witness reports that the plane fell steeply down while in a nose-high attitude. The question was why, something which would be hard to determine without access to the flight data. Fortunately, there was an alternative. Radar from the control tower had recorded the plane's ground speed and altitude throughout the approach. Although less accurate than FDR data, it promised to provide a basic outline of the aircraft's performance. The main thing investigators needed to understand was what configuration allowed the stick shaker to activate just 7 seconds after leveling off at 1,000 feet, and stall just 8 to 10 seconds after that. Based on the airspeeds derived from radar data and known aspects of the configuration revealed by the CVR, the NTSB conducted a series of simulator tests as well as live flight tests to determine which scenarios most closely matched what actually happened to the airplane. They found that the only way to get the airspeed to decay rapidly enough to trigger a stall so quickly was to leave the speed brakes extended after leveling off at 1,000 feet. Although there was no conversations on the CVR about the deployment of the speed brakes, it was considered highly likely that Captain Whitehouse had used them to achieve the descent rate of 1,550 feet per minute after passing the outer marker. The NTSB released its final report, which outlined the whole sequence of events in painstaking detail. Although the crash unfolded in just a few seconds, the stage had been set for the problem much earlier in the approach. This was a classic case of a pilot falling behind his airplane. The trouble started when the pilots became distracted trying to troubleshoot the flight data recorder. This delayed all further tasks while the plane was still continuing towards the airport. As a result, they began their descent from 4,000 feet too late, necessitating the use of the speed brakes to descend faster and make up for the lost time. Now they passed over the outer marker without having finished the final descent check, so they rushed through it, distracting them from actively monitoring their altitude and airspeed due to the hurried nature of events. By the time he leveled off, Captain Whitehouse had forgotten the speed brakes were still extended. Flying with the speed brakes extended resulted in a rapid airspeed decay. The stick shaker and stall warning went off before Whitehouse even had a chance to look at his airspeed reading, and he reacted with solutions that would have worked with the speed brakes stowed, such as increasing thrust to 75% and retracting the flaps and landing gear to reduce drag. But all these measures were insufficient with the speed brakes extended. Once the plane stalled, there wasn't enough altitude to recover. All of these errors can be summarized under what the NTSB called inadequate flight management. A pilot must remain aware of his or her aircraft and what it is doing at all times in order to ensure that airspeed remains within acceptable values and altitude targets are met in a timely manner. On Flight 553, the pilots allowed the airspeed to develop a mind of its own and assumed it wouldn't drop too low instead of carefully tracking it and actively intervening to ensure that it stayed high enough. In order to ensure pilots wouldn't make the same mistakes in the future, the NTSB recommended that pilots be taught the stick shaker could activate at a higher airspeed if the speed brakes were extended. They also recommended that the FAA issue an advisory bulletin informing pilots of the risk of using the speed brakes improperly. The NTSB also called for better standards for crew communication, something which became especially apparent just 3 weeks after the crash of 553, when Eastern Airlines Flight 401 descended into the Everglades and crashed while crew members tried to troubleshoot a burnt-out landing gear light bulb. Based on these two accidents and another accident which occurred at Chicago O'Hare earlier in 1972, the NTSB recommended further that fastened shoulder harnesses should be adapted to the before landing checklist, noting that Captain Whitehouse might have been able to escape the plane if not for debilitating injuries sustained due to not wearing a seatbelt, and that airplanes have illuminated exit signs that can be seen through the dense smoke. These findings were not without controversy.
Of the 61 souls on board, only 18 survived. The remaining 43 perished. Every loss of life was tragic, but several quickly became more. A source of conspiracy theories and a catalyst that possibly contributed to bringing the Watergate scandal to its conclusion. To start with, close to 50 FBI agents descended almost immediately on the scene. If this was due to the plane's high-profile passengers, there was no evidence to that, but conspiracy theories began to spread. George Collins, a congressman and founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. One theory suggests that Collins was targeted due to his association with classified information related to covert government operations. Some believe that his presence on United Flight 553 was no coincidence, and that he carried knowledge that certain factions wanted to suppress. Ralph Blodgett and James Kruger, two Northern natural lawyers. They were among a group of 9 pipeline lobbyists who somehow had come into possession of the Mitchell documents and were trying to get them safely out of Washington. These documents were important to their company in its court hassles as a means of blackmailing the Justice Department through then Attorney General John Mitchell and President Richard Nixon. Anonymously tipped that they would not reach Chicago alive if they absconded with the papers, Blodgett and Kruger nevertheless boarded Flight 553. Michelle Clark, the first African-American woman to serve as a television correspondent for CBS News, and slated to become a correspondent on 60 Minutes in 1973. At the time of her death, Clark was working on reporting related to the Watergate scandal, which was still being covered up. This has led to speculation that if Clark had not died, she might have broken news of the Watergate scandal. Clark's presence on the flight became a feature in conspiracy theories regarding the crash of Flight 553, suggesting that it was related to a cover-up of Watergate. A private investigator who had researched the crash claims to have had witnesses saying they saw her with Mrs. Dorothy Hunt before the flight and that the two boarded together. Dorothy Hunt, a former CIA employee described as a source and asset for the CIA. She was the wife of former CIA covert operative and Watergate conspirator E. Howard Hunt. Once her badly burned corpse was identified using jewelry recovered on her body, reporters, already frenzied by Watergate, went into overdrive. Howard Hunt was under indictment in Washington, D.C., facing a trial with his co-defendants that was scheduled to begin the second week of January 1973. Dorothy was later identified as the paymistress of hush money to the Watergate defendants and their families to keep the burglars from cooperating with authorities and testifying at the trial. Investigators combed through the wreckage and found a packet of $100 bills totaling $10,000 in a purse belonging to Dorothy Hunt. It was also discovered that she had taken out a $225,000 flight insurance policy at Washington National Airport before departing. Informants also said she was carrying $40,000 in new hundreds, traceable to the Barker Fund, plus $2 million in American Express securities made out to cash. Some conspiracy theorists claim that she was also meeting with Michelle Clark, the CBS News reporter, to give an interview about her and her husband's involvement with President Nixon and illicit bribes being paid to the men arrested during the Watergate break-ins. While the crash of United Flight 553 is not particularly well known today, the outcome of the Watergate scandal has ensured that it still gets mentioned from time to time in the discussion surrounding the infamous conspiracy. After the release of tapes proving that President Nixon tried to cover up his campaign's involvement in the Watergate break-ins, Nixon resigned from the presidency under threat of removal from office by the United States Senate. While it was indeed proven that officials connected to Nixon were sending hush money to E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, it was never conclusively shown that the $10,000 in Dorothy Hunt's baggage was intended for this purpose. And despite the release of thousands of documents related to Watergate, no further evidence has come to light in the 51 years since the crash that would connect it to the Watergate scandal. Despite being commonly known as the Watergate plane crash, the presence of Mrs. Hunt on board United Airlines Flight 553 turned out to be nothing more than a tragic coincidence. One of the lessons of the crash is not a traditional safety lesson, but a social one, that not everything is a conspiracy. At the end of the day, the truth usually makes less sense than fiction. We would love to hear your comments and hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe for future content.